Hi, and thank you for tuning into our Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Beloved. Beloved is a 1998 film starring Oprah Winfrey, Danny Glover, Elise Neal, and Sandy Newton. It's based on a Toni Morrison novel, a rather successful Toni Morrison novel, about a character, Seth, who's actually based on a real story. It was a newspaper clipping that Toni Morrison had come across back in the 1970s when she was working as an editor. It was the story of an enslaved woman who attempted to escape with her children, but was captured and forced to return to slavery. But she chose to sacrifice her children, or attempted to kill her children, rather than having them return to slavery. She had multiple children and was able to kill, I think, at least one of them, though some of the children survived. And so coming across this news story, which I remember seeing this from the documentary about Toni Morrison, which I previously reviewed, where seeing this article and being a mother herself, knowing the love that she had for her children, it stuck with Morrison because it made her think of how harrowing the experience of slavery must have been if a mother would choose to kill her children rather than allow them to return to bondage. And so it's actually a pretty astute observation, or it's indeed worthy of consideration, because most mothers, it's like they would do every and anything to protect their children, to safeguard their children. You know, they want to see them not just grow up and survive to adulthood, but to go on and thrive and live happy, if not peaceful, lives as an adult. So to have a mother who, first off, makes the attempt to escape slavery, but then following that tries to kill her children, it does say a lot about, you can only imagine what her experience as an enslaved woman must have been like, given that she would go to such extreme means in an attempt to prevent her children from having the same experience. And so with that, it makes for a really interesting story. Morrison then uses this as sort of like the inspiration for the book Beloved, where Seth is a woman who has murdered her child, right? The real woman's name was Margaret, but here within the movie, Seth is sort of based on that woman. She has like flashbacks to her earlier life, and Seth is portrayed by Oprah Winfrey. And when the movie opens, the bulk of it takes place in the present for them, which is several years after the end of slavery, after emancipation, where Seth is now living as a free woman in a house with her daughter, Denver. And her friend, Paul, portrayed by Danny Glover, he's someone that Seth knew from her days of enslavement back on this plantation sweet home. And so they lived on this plantation as enslaved people. The men attempted to escape, of which Paul D was one, as well as Seth's husband. They attempted to escape. Paul D managed to get away, and this we see over the course of flashbacks. But the others were subjected to absolutely brutal violence, right, and implements of torture. So they were put in chains, neck irons, and things like that, various instruments of torture. And they suffered, you know. So while she was living at Sweet Home, earlier on, she was to some degree under the protection of an older woman in the family. But bearing in mind that while this woman might have offered some degree of protection, at least for a period of time, she still was a participant in the enslavement, the suffering of these people. You know, one could think of it in the sense of, like when we discuss like slave narratives or slavery and things like that, where when slave masters and individuals along those lines were involved in the trade, but not necessarily as brutal as everyone else, it can be easy to ascribe some degree of care and consideration or humanity to that. But the reality is that slavery was at its core economically motivated. And so it wouldn't be in the best interest of anyone involved with slavery, someone who owns a slave, you know, for them to allow their slaves to be brutalized or maimed, you know, in a way that would either render them temporarily or permanently unfit to work. And so her safeguarding Seth, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that she was a good person. I think it's just important to point out. The point is that there were some young white men living on the property who were relatives to this woman, one of which was teacher, and then there were like some other young men who were related to this woman. And it seems like what happened was the older woman exerted some degree of control over the plantation. But this woman becoming older, you know, when we do see her, she's in bed. So I would guess that as a result of her advancing age, she's now like weakened or sick or something along those lines. And with her not being as capable of personally maintaining control of the plantation and thereby safeguarding Seth, you now have these young white men on the property who are just running amok, terrorizing the enslaved people, which was really a reality for people who were enslaved, where there would be some degrees of experience of slavery, where you would have some masters who were just absolutely sadistic, and between them and their proxies, they would just constantly terrorize the enslaved. You had some who didn't go as far, but the problem with being enslaved is that due to your owner either becoming ill, facing financial issues, dying, or anything along those lines, it could have a profound impact upon your life, where you can find yourself going from a somewhat manageable situation or a situation to which you've managed to find a way to cope to now being in an especially perilous environment due to either new people being on the scene in the sense of family members or something like that, or a new overseer being on the plantation. You could find yourself facing the threat of being sold away from your family or friends, your children, spouse, romantic partners, or whatnot, just your social group. And it's like facing brutality because the condition of the enslaved was really dependent on who had control over them at the time, at that moment. Your master finding themselves in financial difficulties could mean that you might then be hired out to some other plantation, or you might even be sold off. Big life-changing moments, and in reading books about slavery and things of that nature, you realize that it might be, your slave master or your slave master's wife might want to just buy a new dress or some new item or something, and lacking the cash, as enslaved people were viewed as pretty much property, really chattel, no different than a horse or a cow or something along those lines. An enslaved person could find themselves sold off because their owner wanted some knick-knack or something along those lines. So it's like this huge life-altering moment for you might be over some petty want by the person who owns you. Where even in instances where it seems like you might have a relatively stable, or let's say less drama-filled existence due to the plantation on which you live with the person that owned you, you can quickly find yourself in absolutely dire straits based on some event far beyond your control. And so that speaks to the instability. Before you even get to the experience of being owned to another person, the reality is that part of being owned is that the conditions of your life, the quality of your life, could change at a moment's notice. Thereby, even people in seemingly secure environments where you might have spent your entire life, you might have grown up and known these people your entire life. An event beyond your control could result in drastic changes to your existence. And so as part of that, this is pretty much the case with Seth, where she'd been at Sweet Home for much of her life. With these young men, it's a bit unclear within the movie whether they came to live on the property or had been there the entire time. But the point is that changes take place on this plantation where they're not just running wild. There's nothing between them and like the lay people on the plantation, right? The living conditions become unbearable. And so we see this through like the flashbacks that Seth has, where it's like the relationship between her and her partner. It's unclear if they were married or not that it makes a big difference, but that she's either given birth to a child or at least that she was like recently pregnant, right? But was producing milk, lactating. The white men on the property sexually assaulted her. And as part of that, there was this thing of them, which is like a phrase that she repeats over and over, that they took her milk. And it's like, think about that. It goes back to this thing of being a mother. Like, this is one of the traits that we use in defining the classification of mammals, right? That mammals have mammary glands. They give birth to live young, and they feed them milk from their own bodies. And it's like, you think about this thing where it's such a natural thing for a woman to give birth to a child and to then sustain the child, to feed the child from milk produced by her body. And it's like in all other areas of life, since it has no control over her being, right? Seth has no control over her being or over her life. They can make decisions that drastically upset her life. And it's like even this seemingly minor natural thing, even that she doesn't have control over where it goes. Right? To show you just how little ownership and control she has over her own body, where not only do these men sexually assault her, not only are they violent towards her, they physically terrorize and torment, physically beat her, but they go so far as to steal her milk. It really drives home the point that Seth has no ownership over her own body. She has no ownership over her children. And even beyond that, it's like the most basic and natural aspects of being a mother, which would be feeding her children, right? Even that these men take from her. And it really just goes to show how inhumane the system was. That this very basic human, not even human, right? Just this basic factor of being a mammal, a capability present within mammals, right? Across different animal groups, different species. You have these individuals who stoop so low, who go so far to exert their power over Seth that they resort to stealing her milk. Where in recent decades, we've moved past this thing with better understanding of sexuality, being separate from assault and rape and things like that. We've come to accept, or at least I would hope that it's now common knowledge, right? That rape is not about desire or passion, right? It's not a result of a loss of self-control, but rather rape is about power. It's one person exerting their desires, their needs over another person, right? One person decides that their needs, their compulsion, what they want is more important than this other person being able to maintain agency over their body. And so as part of that, here we see within the movie, if an individual believes themselves to own you, where they can decide where and when you go, what you do and why, where they control all aspects of your lives, they view themselves as owning you, it's not that far-fetched that if they see themselves as having the right to dictate to you what you do, to forcibly take your labor from you, whether through direct force or coercion, the ability to work and provide for yourself, that they take that from you, they dictate how you function, they take control over you physically, mentally. It's not surprising that as part of that ownership, through this perceived right to control and dominate, they saw themselves as being within their rights to sexually assault this woman, and then went even further to then take her milk. It's like, it's not enough for them to exert control and power over her body, over her sexual decisions, what should be her choice to decide who she does or does not want to have sexual contact with. They take it even further by also exerting their will over her milk. And so with that, it speaks to this thing of an enslaved person's lack of control over themselves, the disregard for their personhood. But then in the case of women, black women, enslaved black women, it even disregards their role as mothers, right? It shows a disregard for motherhood within enslaved women. And it's like, we see it throughout nature where mothers have control over their offspring, right? They give birth, they raise their children, they feed them, they see to their survival and security. But here you see that within this institution of slavery, that a woman lacking control over herself, someone else owning her, thereby means that person is part of the system where she doesn't have self-determination, right? She lacks independence, determination for deciding what happens to her children. What happens to her children is whatever her owner allows. And so to that end, you end up having it where children can be sold away from their parents. Children can be taken away from their parents, sent to work in some other part of the house from their parents. The slave master can override whatever decisions the mother makes. The mother isn't, if the mother is even allowed to make decisions or voice opinions, ends up being like this really strong representation, quite powerful, right? It puts on display this power dynamic. It's a powerful metaphor for the rest of the institution of slavery. In the present, we see Seth and Paul D, where, all this time later, having shared their history, it's a nice thing, right? Especially when you've gone through things, you've had traumatic experiences, you've lost contact with people you knew back when. So then years later, meet up with someone who serves as a connection to your past. And it's like, even if that past or that environment had negative moments, it serves as a positive reminder, a positive connection to some of the positive memories you had. Because in this case, Seth did have a life at Sweet Home. There was at one point in time a man there that she loved, that she chose to be with. She had connections to some of the other people that lived on the plantation, some of the other enslaved people. And it's like, even with all this time having gone by and having endured negativity and bad experiences during her time there, she still had some positive experiences with the people with whom she was enslaved. And so meeting back up with Paul D, they had some negative experiences, but this is someone with whom she can commiserate. It offers a tie back to the people that have died, that have passed away. It's like a connection back to some of the positive aspects of her past. And so it's like we see various aspects of Seth through like a series of flashbacks. And now when Paul D arrives, she's now living in a house that's some distance away from Sweet Home. Turns out that this was the home of her mother-in-law. And so she now lives there with her daughter, Denver. And Paul D comes into town and the two of them reconnect and he stays at the house. Originally, his intention was really just to pass through. But with them reconnecting, they kind of kindle a relationship. And so he decides to stick around for some time, to spend some time with her. And one of the immediate things that he notices is that it feels like there's a presence in the house. And so Seth readily admits to it that pretty much the house is haunted. There's a sense of unease and unrest within the house. And as the story unfolds, we come to find out that this is a result of what took place with her children. And it's like, as Paul D arrives, up to this point, you've had it where Seth and Denver have been living in this house with this spirit. Within the scenery, you notice that the colors are very muted in the house. It doesn't seem like a bright and vibrant, happy home. The camera moves through the house and we see various things from the period, right? It's not a mansion or anything like that, but the colors are very muted. It's not necessarily devoid of happiness, but there's a heaviness. Things move about in the house. There are noises. And when Paul D comes in as a new person who wasn't in the house, as much as the audience, he picks up on these things. They're not commonplace to him. And so he starts to ask questions. And then over the course of the movie, where we see him and Seth forming this relationship, they're starting to build a life together. You then have where they return home after having like a nice outing, the three of them, Seth, Paul D, and Denver, to find this woman out in the yard. Actually like really weird, right? Because she's in the hot baking sun, leaned up against a post, just like snoring away. And I found it to be pretty creepy because prior to this, we as the audience see this woman getting out of the water and she's covered in bugs and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, here she is just now like standing in the yard. Not really normal human behavior. Like initially when she tries to speak, she has like this gravelly, scratchy voice along the lines of if you've been in like a deep sleep or you've had a sore throat where you haven't been speaking for some time and you're now kind of working your way back around to speaking. Your voice might be a little bit coarse. It might sound a little bit weak, a little scratchy and whatnot. And so that's what she sounds like. And so you see her like stumbling and bumbling around and whatnot, along the lines of what you would expect from like a toddler. But it's kind of unsettling because you're seeing this grown woman. Initially, it seems like she's just some random stranger who happens upon the house and they welcome her in, right? Extend some hospitality. But over the course of the rest of the movie, we come to realize that this woman, beloved, is, I think, others might disagree, like the child that Seth killed, returned from the dead, right? Trying to get revenge, sort of to reclaim Seth, right? Retribution for what Seth did to her. And so it makes for like a really creepy movie. It's not a perfect movie. It's pretty long at about 3 hours. I've been finding it difficult to find good movies, right? Black movies with enough depth to analyze and discuss. And so for October, I felt like, a scary movie would be kind of fitting for the month. And so Beloved seemed like a pretty good pick. So at one level, you have this thing about this unsettled spirit trying to reclaim Seth and like the initial elation and then later destruction that she seems to suffer, right? And having this person come and upset her life. But at the same time, like the story is interesting, but what struck me even more, what I found even more terrifying was the insights it imparts with regards to enslaved women and men's experiences during slavery and just this complete lack of control over oneself. What it might have been like, the various ways in which your life could just be in a permanently precarious state. I found that to be more terrifying than Beloved and her weirdness. This broader story of what led to, Seth killing her children or killing this child. That was unsettling. The movie might not be a horror movie in the traditional sense, but it certainly does point to, the horrors of slavery. And so with that, it's a pretty interesting movie. There are some flaws. It's not perfect, but it is a good movie, especially if you dig a little bit deeper into it. And it serves in a sense as a companion to the book, where, especially knowing the backstory, it's certainly a work of fiction, but knowing that it's based on a real case, it is pretty interesting. And so with that, I recommend Beloved. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.